Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depends on where you're dialing in from. Welcome to this webinar. So we're starting very much on time. I'm giving people who joined late another minute or two to join. Those who just now recently joined, very much welcome. We're giving other participants in only another 30 to 60 seconds to join, and then we'll start this webinar. In case anyone wants to try out the chat and see whether it works, please go ahead. You can find it in the right bottom of the screen. At least that's where you should be able to find it. Good morning, Franklin. So chat is working, that's the good news. All right, so 1 minute past 10, at least here with me. I'm in Amsterdam. Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this webinar about a pretty broad topic. 2026 updates in the area of global mobility at the end of the day. We have a 30-minute session here. Of course, I love to hear myself talking, but I'm rather here for you. So if you have any questions or comments, please use the chat. Franklin already found it. You should be able to find it at the right bottom of your screen. There's also a separate tab specifically for questions. You can use that too. I've got my lovely colleague Shri in the backend helping me out to moderate if there are any questions, either in the questions tab or in the chat tab. Don't want to scare you away, but if you prefer this session in German, you're obviously in the wrong place right now because we're talking English, but in only 1 hour from now, we have this session as well in German. Frank Jura will then do the moderation. So in case you prefer German, feel free to drop out and join back in an hour. I will now go to the next slide and tell you a little bit about me. I hate this picture, but look, I'm not here for my looks anyway. My name is Pieter. I'm Dutch, one of the co-founders here at WorkFlex, and I have a background in tax law. So I'm a tax lawyer, certified here in the Netherlands, but I've worked also in Germany for quite a long time. At PwC, that's where I started my career, always supporting large employers with their global mobility compliance. And then when I was in Germany, I basically led the remote work proposition for PwC in Europe. But then for circa 5 years ago, basically at the time of the Vialto carve-out from PwC, I carved out myself and I started WorkFlex. And WorkFlex has been growing pretty fast. If you don't know who we are, that would be weird because you came to this webinar obviously through WorkFlex. We're building the one and all global mobility compliance platform. Yeah, that's pretty exciting. So that is me. Again, if you have any questions on the content that we're going to go through today, just use the chat or use the questions tab on the right-hand side of your screen. I'm just by myself. It's also only 30 minutes. And what we are going to cover is basically a short update on a variety of global mobility updates, trends, if you will, that we've seen over the past, well, basically 8 months that we're now into 2026. And if you were to summarize it, nothing much happened, but then still a lot happened. So yeah, that's a little bit mysterious, and I'll come back to it once we go through the various smaller topics. So first, we're going to look at EU border a little bit. Posting an A1, so PWDs and A1s is the second topic. The big and bold area of corporate tax. Probably we don't have too many corporate tax specialists here on this call, but I do want to give you a quick update on, let's say, at least those corporate tax rules that are relevant for global mobility. Look a little bit beyond the EU, and of course, close it off with some action points or things to keep in mind over the next couple of months of 2026. Right, going into the first topic, the EU border. As you probably by now know as well, the biometric entry and exit is live, and so Schengen days are now counted automatically. But then ETIAS, yes, that is next. So here's the more detailed slide on this topic. So the good news is the first progress has now been made with the digital exit and entry system of the EU. And so the Schengen days for incoming travelers are now actually counted automatically. The question is, of course, is there actually already something being done with this? My gut feeling tells me no, but obviously, and we've seen that in the UK as well, once you start counting or start checking every single traveler, the step towards actually doing something with that information is much, much easier. So I think a very big step has been made. On the other hand, yeah, little has changed for now. But we're definitely heading into that direction where overstays will actually service at the border right away and not months later, or not at all. It is also a current alternative. Then the ETIAS, so the European equivalent of the ESTA, or the European equivalent of the UK ETA, if you will. That should be the next step in this whole process. But yeah, the implementation date has been fluid, and the trend is not our friend. I'd like to say it that way. It was already extended quite a few times. It now should be going live end of this year, 2026. But yeah, recent reports coming from the EU, let's say, operational legislators, suggests that there is again another extension coming up, and that it will not be live before early 2027. And then every traveler from outside the EU region will require an ETIAS that you have to buy. Unlikely that it's really going to be difficult to obtain it, similar to a UK ETA or a US ESTA. Of course, depends a little bit on your passport, but yeah, with a 20 euro fee and a kind of normal passport, you should be able to get the ETIAS quite easily. And so then the impact will be limited. But yeah, the question now is when this will actually be live. And of course, still, then also the question pops up, now that we know where everybody, how long someone's going to be in the Schengen area, we've got the ETIAS in place, what's going to happen with that information? You do see a trend, of course, happening in the world of increased protectionism, increased border controls. So again, the step towards actually doing something with that information is much easier. And at least, yeah, you can't just travel to the EU then anymore without the ETIAS. And of course, people have to get used to it a little bit. By now, everybody's used to US ESTAs. The majority will probably be used to UK ETAs. ETIAS are next. Quite some updates on PWDs and A1s over the past months. But again, there's a lot of updates, and at the end of the day, nothing much happened for now. So what were the updates? We go to the detailed slide on this topic here. So it's clear that somewhere in the EU, they're building a single portal for posted worker declarations. So you all know, hopefully, those registrations in the destination country based on the posted worker directive that needs translation in national law. So you see with PWD notifications quite often that when when a trip is needs to be reported or registered, depends a little bit on the countries. For instance, for Germany, it depends a little bit on the sector where you're working in. For Switzerland, it's not so much dependent on the sector. More or less every trip needs to be registered. In Belgium, definitely every trip needs to be registered. Then in the Netherlands, my home country, it's a little bit different, depends really on the trip purpose. And so every country has a little bit of their own set of rules. With this portal, they're trying to harmonize that a little bit, but what's much more important that they want to harmonize is that also currently more or less every country has their own process for putting those PWD notifications in. Sometimes they're using a similar platform, like the platform where you request A1s. Sometimes it's an entirely different platform. Sometimes it's even still in hard copy. What they're going to try now is build a single portal where you can register trips for every PWD country, if you will. And there has been a lot of commitment from the various countries, so at least enough commitment from single member states to say, yeah, look, if this portal is going to be there, I am going to allow users to actually use that portal. There's two problems I still see. One is, well, you only have to look at the ETIAS to know how difficult the EU finds it to implement a single platform for something. ETIAS has been extended now with years, and yeah, the expectation is, or the question I think is fair to ask, why will the portal for PWD notifications be any better or faster? So I think that's question mark number one. Question mark number two is, currently the processes are very different. Some countries require a lot of information on the PWD notification. For instance, Switzerland, they're a lot more extensive than the Belgian PWD notification. And it's going to be very difficult on that unified platform to balance all that. And I'm not so sure how successful the people are going to be with this. So that's a very big question mark, what that portal is now actually going to look like. My personal expectation, a lot has happened. The announcement comes that this portal is being developed, but nothing much will happen in the next, well, at least the next 12 months, in my expectation. But I might be wrong, and I'll keep you posted, of course. On the A1s, if you follow WorkFlex a little bit, you will have seen the big A1 reform that is now more or less finally decided upon. So there are still a step or two to be taken in order for the new EC regulation to be really adopted. But I think by now we're only looking at formalities, really. So it is clear that this A1 reform will take place. And what does it mean? A very big simplification, I think, for employers, namely that for short-term trips and for defined business trips, no A1 certificate will have to be obtained. Currently, you should be obtaining an A1 certificate, but when you have to do this is a little bit unclear. So the good news is, in many cases in the future, you will not have to ask for an A1. The bad news is, I think, twofold. One, for those trips that require an A1, you actually do require it going forward upfront. So you can't leave it in the dark. You will have to put a system in place to first figure out whether an A1 is required, and then if one's required, that you actually ask for it upfront. In combination with the EES and the ETIAS, it's pretty likely that you will actually be denied entry or run into issues, at least, if you then did not get the A1 in time. And the other problem is there's another, let's say, tiny note in this EC regulation that also says the accumulated presence of the traveler plays into the question, or the answer to the question, whether you need an A1 or not. And so not only do you need to put a system in place that checks, do I need an A1, and if so, I do it in time, but it also accumulates the presence. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of good news with this A1 reform that's being announced, but also some bad news. By the way, for those of you who are active in the construction sector, more bad news, because they're generally exempt from the exclusion to request for A1s for short-term stays. The reason for this is that the construction sector is obviously an area where quite a lot of accidents happen, and so the European legislators didn't want to just put an exemption for them in place. Yes, that's a big change. At the end of the day, what happens now? Nothing much. It will take another couple of years for this new EC regulation to be really in force. And so, it's important to keep an eye on it for now, but also you are in a good place if you are just joining this webinar. You've heard this now, and you can just keep an eye. You will have to adjust your systems, but only just a little bit later on. We do expect that the legislators also now, after final adoption of the EC regulation, will share more details on how are you supposed to accumulate presence? What exactly is defined as a business trip? Because the term now in the EC regulation is a little bit unclear, leaves for a lot of gray area. And yeah, we expect those gray areas to be clarified over the next months and quarters. All right, so I see some questions being asked in the chat, mainly around slides and recordings and all that. If you have any questions on the topic here, feel free to ask them there as well. I'll try to answer them as we go. All right, we're at the corporate tax topic. So a little bit more of a technical one, called it the tax trap under the work from abroad. For those of you who don't know too much about corporate tax, well, good for you. I do kind of like it. It's very interesting. So corporate tax in the area of global mobility, business travel, or remote work is very important. If you look at all the risk dimensions that are applicable on work from abroad, either as a business trip or whatever, usually for the traveler, him or herself, the visa risk dimension is the most important one, because you might be denied entry into the country. What you see for companies, for employers, is that they usually care a lot about the corporate tax risk dimension. Why? Because you, as a large company, you've probably got a tax department that has spent maybe even millions of euros on a Big Four or tax advisor to very carefully craft a global structure. And you don't want a single business traveler or a single project or a single remote worker to mess up this carefully crafted structure just because you didn't pay attention. And so the topic of corporate tax and global mobility is really around, well, dependent agent PE is an individual during a business trip signing contracts or making important business decisions, and might that constitute some kind of local presence, enough local presence in the destination country to trigger a PE. What does that trigger? It triggers a local corporate tax requirement. Not necessarily expensive in terms of the taxes that you're going to have to pay, but it will be expensive in terms of the administrative effort that you're going to have to put in, because you will then have to file a local corporate income tax return. And so, long story short, what you as a HR global mobility expert do not want is your workationers, your business travelers, probably even your remote workers. You don't want them to constitute a PE. Now, for dependent agent, we just touched upon it. What we've seen over the past years, since COVID really, but also again over the past year, we see that the OECD, kind of like the supranational body that issues a lot of policy on global PE, trying to further clarify when does a remote worker or a workationer constitute what we now basically call the home office PE. So when does a remote worker create enough substance in the country where he or she works from, either structurally or maybe temporarily, usually a little bit longer than just a week or two, of course. But when does this happen? And there's increasing policy around this. That's the good news. The bad news is this policy still remains quite difficult to, it still leaves for a lot of gray area. What you also see is that countries by themselves have made policy. For instance, Germany has gone quite pragmatic on home office PE for remote workers in Germany. But you see, especially in the Scandinavian countries, at first they were going at it quite progressively or aggressively, if you will, saying that local home office PEs are considered quite quickly. But you do see a little bit of a change, or I guess a development there. And what you see mainly, it's also now the more recent policy, is that they say, look, remote workers do not always just constitute a PE, especially if they have no local, let's say, business they create. So for instance, the remote worker in Denmark, is he or she developing the Danish business for the company? If so, okay, then definitely home office PE or dependent agent PE comes into play. It's a big question to ask yourself. But if this individual has no reason to work on the Danish market and just lives there, maybe because his partner had to move there for her job, and you allowed him to work remotely from there for a limited number of years, but he still works for either the German headquarter or the Dutch headquarter or the Italian headquarter. if he doesn't work on Danish business, there's a pretty good reason to argue for this person not constituting a home office PE. Very good question, Sam. Sorry for not explaining that clearly. So PE is short for permanent establishment, and it basically means a corporate income tax presence. So the most obvious example of a PE is if you have a GmbH or a limited somewhere and you've registered with the tax authorities. However, this is not a requirement to trigger local corporate income tax in the country. It could also simply be a person or a building without you having any done registrations. The German word for it is Betriebsstätte. I can't see where you're from. A permanent establishment, the English term, the Dutch term, vaste inrichting. So yeah, it's basically corporate income tax presence, a PE. So remote workers might still create PEs, but they do not always have to create PEs. And so, yeah, thanks, Jenny. And that's where the OECD is increasingly basically trying to make the gray area a little bit less gray, because it is very difficult for companies to work through this. And like I said, because there's been so much money spent on global governance structures, you don't want to get this wrong. So the gray area still exists, and the OECD is still planning to work. This is from very recently. The OECD is still planning for simpler tax rules for cross-border remote work. I did contact the OECD, and there's no concrete follow-up for this plan at the moment. So yeah, the task here would rather to be watch for 2027 and what's going to be what's happening over there or then. Looking at the time, I think we're good in time. Quickly looking beyond the EU a little bit. Of course, there's additional social security treaties still being concluded now between Sweden and Brazil, and also new tax treaties or updated tax treaties are being concluded. The good news that for most of the treaties that you see nowadays, they are very much still based on, let's say, the OECD framework treaty that exists. And so if you look at the content, it's very similar to the content that you see in general social security treaties and in general tax treaties. One bigger trend that you see now here with the UAE, but like a lot of other countries that you see listed here, and we've talked about Europe already, is that ETAs, or visas upon arrival, which are technically ETAs, if you will, of course, technically a little bit different, but it's more of the same. It is becoming the new normal. Sometimes that's good because it replaces an actual visa. There was a lot of work to obtain. Sometimes it's not so good because if you look at the ETIAS, for instance, or the UK ETA, I beforehand did not require anything to travel to the UK. Now I do require an ETA. And so for quite a lot of travelers, ETAs are an additional administrative effort or an additional bureaucratic effort. But it is becoming the new reality, allowing governments to be able to strictly check what's happening in this world of data. I can only imagine what this is going to look like in a few years from now. And yeah, it's just becoming the new normal. And of course, it also is a little bit of a consequence of the increased protectionism or increased scrutiny of, well, for instance, the two world powers at the moment. You see this happening. ETAs are being installed in many, many more countries. I do want to touch upon one thing that doesn't have a separate slide, but we already talked about world powers a little bit. You may have seen that, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, the biggest world power at the moment, the US, again, tries to play around with the H-1B. If you didn't see it, a little bit of a backstory. H-1B, let's say the longer term work permit for the US. You will remember that they introduced this $100,000 fee for this. I think it was probably around a year ago, something. What you may have missed is that that fee was actually scratched by one of the US judges, and said it was unlawful, and so it will not be able to be put in practice to actually pay this fee. That's the good news. The bad news is that quite quickly thereafter, the administration has now said that they are looking to introduce more of the same. It's a little bit of a different background, but it's a $103,000 fee to cover for costs or anything. Again, a very big barrier they're trying to install to get the H-1B visa, which wasn't already easy to get. It was also limited in general already on an annual basis, so it was very hard to get one. And obviously this $103,000 fee or cost allowance that they are trying to go and push through will not make it any easier. It's not a fact yet, and of course, you know what happens in the US. They're now going to try and scratch that too, or try to stop it from actually becoming law. But it is something that, there was quite a recent update there. And yeah, it does really play into this whole visa update, increased protectionism, increased bureaucracy. And you see that also in the world of increased, let's say, environmental and societal change. I look at it from a high level and I see a lot of changes happening, and we kind of make fun sometimes about it within WorkFlex, saying we should maybe just rename the Global Mobility Department to the Breaking Down Barriers Department, because your job, our job, in order to, let's say, make global work possible is becoming harder. And we can complain as much as we want about these protectionism rules, about, let's say, societal unrest or climate change, making environmental crisis in places where you and I live, even though it wasn't really in our backyards before, plus the bureaucratic issues. We can complain about it as much as we want, but we'd rather live with it and try to push through. So we have to break down those barriers. And yeah, this $103,000 fee is a good example of it. So yeah, what to do now? Break down those barriers. Of course, I think the main to-do, as the message from this webinar is, nothing much happened, but a lot has happened. Keep an eye on these developments. ETIAS is very important, right? It will be live at one point, and then your travelers do need an ETIAS. Start preparing for that A1 reform. Start tracking your trips. In the process, when you start tracking your trips, you will also count the days, which puts you in a good position for the EES system that is in place. And if you have any remote work arrangements, either temporarily or even more so if they're structurally, you get them reviewed on a regular basis, because the regulations simply are being updated quite regularly. All right, so this was my story. I don't know if there's any questions. You can drop them in the chat. I'll go to the closing slide. We had a few questions left and right. Thank you so much for those. If there's anything unclear still, you've got 3 more minutes to share your question. And in the meantime, you can, of course, just scan this QR code and learn more about our newest kid on the block. We started with workation compliance at WorkFlex. We added business travel compliance. We've added visa, SOS. We've also added assignment compliance now. Quite an exciting solution. And we'd love you to learn more and give us feedback. And there we have a question. Thank you, Caroline. Do you need an A1 to go, say, to France? Do you attend a conference for 5 days? Well, at the moment, yes, because the new regulations are not in place yet. Under the new regulation, probably you will not require an A1 for this. Why not? Obviously, the stay is longer than 3 days, but they say if the trip qualifies as a business trip, regardless of its duration, you also do not require an A1. And what they have said, and that's why this I can actually answer, Caroline, they have said that a regular conference would indeed qualify as a business trip. So if that conference is, well, in your example, 5 days, right, or 6 or 7, you wouldn't need an A1. Got time for one more question, and I see that some people were typing. No questions yet. No, you don't need an A1 for 5 days trip, May. Under the new regulations, right? Today you still need it. In the new regulations, they say that attending a conference is a business trip, and regardless of the duration of a business trip, you don't need an A1. So the 3-day rule and the business trip, they're actually two separate exemptions, if you will. If I live in Spain and I'm originally from Germany, want to go for 2 weeks to Germany and meet with my company there for 2 days, does that count as business travel? Good question, Anna. Yeah, that's a lot more difficult question. The question is, does it qualify as a business trip? And what exactly that term means is difficult. A conference, yes, will be a business trip. I'm thinking if you're going for 2 weeks, probably a little bit unlikely to really qualify as a business trip. You want to meet your company there. But yeah, I'm sorry to have to give, for now, the lawyer answer. It depends. It's not entirely clear yet whether this would be qualified as a business trip. I don't think it will, to be honest. The objective of the A1 reform is really to exclude short-term trips, whether they're business trips or not, but short-term trips. And 2 weeks is already a little bit longer. So I think unlikely, and what you'll see once they start clarifying the law is that this will probably not really qualify as a business trip anymore. So now we are at 10:30. Thanks so much for being here. Thank you so much for dropping in your questions. If there are any questions that drop in later, now after me closing this webinar, I will try to answer them. You will be able to see the recording, slides. Sri already answered that question. That leaves me with saying thank you and have a wonderful rest of this Wednesday. Thank you. Bye-bye.